Hello, how are you doing? I want to discuss everything that I read over the month of June, and this video is a little bit delayed. I'm usually much more prompt in my reading wrap-ups, although now this is making me feel like an adolescent who's keeping a diary and starting out the diary by saying, sorry, I haven't written in you in so long. Did anybody else do that when they were younger, trying to keep a diary and then just forget about it for months on end? But I've been quite busy in the past few weeks, but also some of these books I've not really discussed all that much anywhere else, so I wanted a chance to get into them deep. But also, June was quite an exciting month for me. I was very lucky. I got to go to 2 different book prize ceremonies and interview my favorite author, so I feel incredibly fortunate. Now, I had quite a mixed bag of reading experiences where some of the books I read were excellent and some were not so good. So I'm going to get into all of my thoughts and feelings about them. But firstly, of course, it was wonderful to go to the Women's Prize ceremony and to be standing in the audience right at the front to see the Safekeep win this award. And what an incredible speech it was for that, and a really exciting event. And also see Bernadine Evaristo collect an award, a special one-off award for outstanding contribution by an author in honor of the 30th anniversary of this award. But also, yeah, at one point, the author was standing at the side in a group of people after she had won this, and I kind of wanted to go and say hello, but I just wasn't quite brave enough to do that, although I did go and speak to Elizabeth Strout and her lovely husband James, and so that was really a big plus. But yeah, I didn't quite get the courage to talk to her. But also it was fantastic to see Rachel Clark win this award, although I've still not read this book. I've heard it is so heart-wrenching, and so I just need to sort of emotionally steel myself for the experience. But it sounds like a really profound and moving read, so looking forward to this. And also I got to go to the Orwell Prize ceremonies and see the author Donal Ryan win the award for his novel Heart Be at Peace, and he gave a really great speech for that, and I've really admired so much of his fiction. And also I read this just recently before the ceremony, and although I didn't realize until I was reading it that it's a sequel to his previous book, The Spinning Heart, which is one of his only books that I haven't read. But this novel does continue on with some of the same characters in a small community in Ireland in a period after the events of the first book, which deals with the financial crash in Ireland in 2008 and how it affects this community, and it shows the continuing effects of the people in this area. Though I don't feel like I really missed out on not reading that first book. You know, I don't think it's a kind of sequel in the sense that there are certain characters and events that you need to know about before going into this, which maybe is the case with Elizabeth Strout. But with this book, I felt like I fully understood, or with some taking some time with these characters, that I really got to know them and all of their connections and relationships to each other, and the events of the story, and primarily it centers around how this community has been taken over by the drug trade, and how various members of the community are aware of this or involved in it in some way, and it traces all of those connections by switching between the voices of 21 different characters, and each of them feels so distinct and reveals something about the larger events that are going on, but also their relationships to each other, and things that, and because many of these characters they might misunderstand each other in some ways, or not entirely they may think they know what the other characters are thinking, but they don't always exactly know. And it's really moving how some of them, there's like an old man who discovers how a building on his plot of land is being used for this drug trade, and how other people are sucked into it because of desperate circumstances. And it's a really moving story, and Donal Ryan's writing is so emotional and powerful. So I really enjoyed reading this, and I think it'll be kind of interesting now to go back and read The Spinning Heart, knowing some of these characters and where they go in their lives, and to sort of see them at their beginnings in the story. So I'm really looking forward to going back and reading that. But also it was wonderful at the Orwell Prizes to see the nonfiction prize go to this book, Looking at Women, Looking at War. And very sadly, the author died in Ukraine during an attack. And so this English translation was published after her death, and so her husband was there, and her editor was there at the ceremony, and gave very moving speeches. So I'm really looking forward to reading this as well. Although, yes, of course, it's another one that a nonfiction book that I'll really need to sort of emotionally steel myself for. So I want to discuss some of the books that I've not really talked about all that much, including Dream State by Eric Puchner. Now, this novel I was really looking forward to. It was an Oprah's Book Club pick, and I've heard lots of positive things about it. It's been on some best books of the year lists so far, and so yeah, it's come with a lot of praise. And the central premise of this story I like, and I think it's really bold in its storytelling and where it goes, where it's basically about a love triangle between these three individuals, a man and his best friend, and the woman that he is going to marry, and the complicated relationship between them over a long period of time. And it follows them for many years and follows down through the generations. And so also where society is going with sort of climate change, but also changes to these characters' lives, and following the full trajectory of their lives. And I thought it was quite poignant, how it captures this sense of aging and not quite achieving our aspirations, and taking certain paths in life, and then not being sure if we've taken the right path, and questioning all of that, but also the bonds and of relationships and the fluctuations of those relationships. And it deals with some really big issues, like not just relationships, but also drug addiction and Alzheimer's disease, and chronic illnesses. And so yeah, it deals with a lot of big issues and economic hardship, and but yes, and also big environmental issues. But I think what I really struggled with this novel is the writing and the tone of the writing, where it often felt like it had this kind of blokey sense of humor about it, where I felt like the author was constantly nudging me and making these jokes and trying to get me to laugh. But I didn't find much of it at all funny, and that's always a really jarring experience for me as a reader, when I feel like the author wants me to laugh and is making jokes, but I'm not finding it funny. And I had that experience quite a lot with when reading Andy Weir's novel about sort of going to Mars and a man getting stranded on Mars, where it was all this kind of quite like masculine sense of humor. There's a lot of fart references in this novel, and of course, that's a biological function, it's part of life and all of that, but it just made me cringe a bit, and some of a lot of the humor just made me like, oh no, I'm not really finding that funny, and I'm not really, it's not really adding to the story to me. And uncomfortably at some points it felt like the jokes were kind of at the expense of the female protagonist in this novel, and that made me quite uncomfortable. I just didn't really get on with the tone of this book, and that kind of took me out of the story a bit, and I didn't entirely believe some of the characters, but you know, there was a scene in the book that I thought was great and really gripping, and did make me laugh in a kind of like cringe way, when an author goes for a reading at a local bookstore and it goes disastrously wrong, and that scene I did find really funny, and just that it was so uncomfortable, and I could picture it so clearly, but yeah, otherwise, I really struggled with bits of this book, and I know a number of readers who gave up on reading it. And I did read it all the way through, and I was glad to do so, because it goes to some really surprising places later on in the story, in following these characters later in their lives, and the next generation of these characters. But yeah, as a whole, this book didn't entirely work for me, and I'm kind of surprised at all of the praise that it's been getting. And another book that I read, which I've not really talked about much yet, is Sakina's Kiss by Vivek Shanbhag. And this story takes place in India, and follows a household where the couple have kind of worked their way up and have established jobs. They've become educated and established a life for themselves, and they have a daughter. She's going to university, and it's narrated from the husband's point of view. And at the very beginning of the book, they get a knock on the door with some men who are looking for their daughter, and it's all very mysterious what their intentions or meaning is. And the story goes off from there, and they can't locate their daughter for a while, and there's this frantic search for her, and they eventually return to their apartment, which has been broken into. And so that's the main events of the story. But what it's really about, I think, is following this man who feels sort of caught between two different existences, where he's aspiring to be a professional, to be successful, and wants his daughter to be so as well. But she has political feelings and wants to be a journalist, and this really frustrates him, and so it's being caught between him having liberal values, but then actually embodying those values is a different thing, and I think that's the real tension of the story. And so he feels very conflicted about his daughter's aspirations, but he's also recalling how there's a lost uncle of his who was also very political, and who disappeared at one point because he became an activist, and then just didn't return to the family home, and the reverberations of that. And the title of this book really threw me for quite a long time, and it's only revealed at a certain point the meaning of it, and it's quite a complicated meaning, which I won't go into, but it's kind of, it's interesting how that why it's titled this, or considering why it would be titled this, and thinking about the meaning of that. And so it's definitely an interesting story, but one that I'm still sort of struggling to figure out my feelings about entirely. In one way, I feel like it's not as dramatic as it should be, or at least as the story, the premise of the novel would lead you to believe it is. It's much more subtle and just following their day-to-day experiences as they go searching for their daughter and are thinking back on their relationship. And the relationship between him and his wife is so tender and special. And there's this really lovely scene where they're on their honeymoon and they both realize that they both love reading self-help books. And it just feels like a really touching connection, which they're both sort of embarrassed about doing. But then when they discover that the other one also likes reading self-help books, it's this really lovely moment of connection between them. So yeah, this was a curious story, an interesting one that I've not heard about many other places, but one that I was glad to read. And I also read Joyce Carol Oates' big new novel, Fox. And of course, I got to interview her about this as well. And it was so fascinating hearing her reflections and thoughts about this story, and really surprising to me how she discusses how she felt such a strong connection to many of the characters. And this is something about Joyce Carol Oates' writing that it feels like she, as an individual, isn't really in her novels very much. I mean, so many books you read and they feel very autobiographical in ways. And we talked about this in the interview, how she's a teacher and many of the students and the pieces of fiction that they're writing that they feel very thinly autobiographical. But Joyce Carol Oates isn't that way, or in any obvious way. So it's quite surprising hearing her discuss how strongly she identified with some of these characters, like the character of P. Caddy, and how much she identified her as someone who works in academia and who is very ambitious and driven, but also really lonely in a lot of ways. And really, her dog is the closest connection that she has. And the story, which is really a mystery, which begins as a mystery in a kind of classic way of a body being found and there being suspects and a detective who is on the case. But then there is the larger mystery of the individual of Francis Fox who goes missing and who is a serial pedophile, and how it goes into his perspective and seeing his motivations and what he does is really difficult to read about, and also is really interesting asking her about this, because I know so many readers struggle with reading about such difficult subject matter, but how she compares this to Moby Dick, and say you can't read Moby Dick without really getting into the story of the whale and the conflict with the whale, and to fully show the horror and the violence of this. And so I think it's so bold how she goes to these really dark places that I think many authors and many of us readers are kind of frightened to go to, but as a way of really grappling with these subjects, because the story was inspired by a real case of something that occurred like this, and so showing this side of American life that I think a lot of us don't want to look at, but which is a part of it, and especially in following the events after the case of this pedophile, and showing the fallout of that, and how does a community deal with that of there were so many people that loved this individual and some who still defend him, and so showing the complications of that I think is so well done. And also, it was absolutely wonderful reading Sarah Moss's novel Ripeness, which this story just so surprised me and took me over, because as it follows the life of a woman going backwards and forwards in time, from her earlier life to her later life in two different locations, and how there is a whole middle of her life which is absent from this story, but in showing the beginning of her life and her coming into herself as a person, and then later in her life reckoning with the past, but also feeling very content with the position that she's ended up with. I think it's a really bold way of portraying an individual's life and finding a sense of place in the world, and considering a number of different cases of illegitimate children and where they have gone in their life, and people who have been displaced, and so finding a sense of home, but also a sense of security in yourself. I think this is so beautifully written, and it has a certain power to the prose and the description in this story that just took over me, and so I felt so emotionally involved by the end of this story. And I think Sarah Moss is such a talented writer in this way. And it was wonderful reading Anthony Shapland's short novel, A Room Above a Shop, this story of a couple's relationship in Wales, a secret gay relationship which happened in a small community, and how their relationship could only be expressed within the confines of the walls of this room above a shop which one of them ran and the other one worked in. And so the community just assumed that they were colleagues and were staying in this room with a partition in it, but really the partition was taken down very early on, and they had such a strong emotional and sexual connection with each other, and following them over a few years, and the pressures on this relationship as it's occurring in the 1980s, and there's widespread homophobia in this area, so they know that it's not safe for them to come out, but capturing different moments in their lives, both as a couple, but also as individuals, and how it creates this larger sense of their lives and this time period and this area. I think is so well done and skillful, how that's all compressed into short sections, and is also very poetically and beautifully written. So this I think is an absolutely wonderful novel. And I also read with our June choice in my online book club was Audition by Kitamura. And this is such a tricksy story, which really caught me off guard because I was sort of expecting a certain twist in the story, but that was not the twist I was expecting. And following a woman, an anonymous woman, not anonymous, but she's unnamed, an unnamed woman who meets a young man in a restaurant, and they're trying to figure out their connection with each other, and then how there's a switch in the story, and following her and her relationship with her husband, but also with this young man over time, and how there are so many small details in this story that could be interpreted in so many different ways, that I found it a great brain teaser in a lot of ways, but also quite frustrating, because I knew that from listening to interviews with Katie Kitamura, that she designed it this way so that there couldn't be any firm conclusion, and really it's all about what the reader makes of this story. So I tried to take it on its own terms of just how I understood this story, and primarily as a portrayal of relationships, but also about the question of whether we want to have children or not, and the positives and negatives of having children or not having children. And I think that's where this story was so meaningful for me. I felt like it was a bit forced where it goes on later on in the book, where suddenly it becomes very dramatic and weird, and in a way that I felt like the author felt like there needed to be a big sort of climax, and that felt a bit forced for me, but also with the way that this novel considers performance and the way we present ourselves to the world, since the central character is an actress, so of course she's thinking about acting all the time, and how the way she is speaking and the way she is positioning her body, what that conveys to people who are viewing her, but also question it kind of raises questions about how much does her interpretations of other people's understanding of her, how much of those are actually true and how much is it just sort of in her head. And so it raises all sorts of interesting questions like this, as well as what actually occurs in the story and the overall meaning of it. So yeah, really interesting book with lots to chew over, and a great one to discuss in a book club, because yeah, there's so many different points of view that you can have about this book. Now, Sean Hewitt's novel Open Heaven was one that I initially was really into and was enjoying, because the language in this is so poetic, the way he writes about nature, and the sense of being drawn back to a memory of a man who returns to his small hometown and thinking of his first love there, when he was a teenager, and falling in love with another teenage boy who kind of arrived in this community as an outsider, and how he befriended him and they formed this really strong connection, which wasn't sexual, but which did have an emotional closeness to it. And I really liked that premise at first, but then overall, I think where I really struggled with this book was questioning the meaning of it in its examination of this relationship from the past, and how the character, in this being a retrospective story of him remembering this, that he holds such importance on this early relationship, and that his current relationship and marriage has broken up because it's not achieving what this early love, first love, did for him. And that seems to me a very strange point of view that I felt like needed a lot more examining of why he was so hung up on this early relationship. Because I'm sure all of us have, first loves or people that we think back on our teenage years of people that we were so enamored with, and that were kind of became our whole world, and that we were obsessed with. And of course, I'm not saying that that's not important and that those feelings weren't valid. But for me now, thinking back on that retrospectively, I think, oh gosh, I'm so glad that I didn't continue on having some of these early relationships, and thinking much more critically about the people that I was so, completely enamored with, that, when you have these passionate feelings, you just become blinded to any of the complications or flaws in those relationships, or with that person themselves. And of course, you never know. I mean, maybe it all would have worked out, but I think it's probably for the best that some of those early relationships are left behind, whereas the narrator in this story is so hung up on that early relationship that is all he wants to achieve, and it's like he wants to have that again. Whereas me now, thinking back on that, I'm like, oh, I'm so glad I'm done with that, and I've left that all behind. And so maybe it's just a fundamental disagreement I have in kind of sensibility with the narrator of this story and where I am in my life. But yeah, and he does really capture the passion and excitement of that early love, but also the monotony of it. And where it became really boring for me was that it kind of kept going through these cycles of like, oh, he's so wonderful, and I'm so in love with him, and he's my whole world, and of course, yes, to portray the honesty of that experience is a valid thing to do, but it feels like this story just does that over and over and over again, and that becomes so repetitious and dull. And if you hear a young person talking about the person they're obsessed with, then that becomes quite dull when it just goes over and over and over again. And so yeah, I got so frustrated with this book and ended up really not liking it. And I did read it through all the way to the end, but yeah, I kind of wish I'd given up on it early on. And finally, the last book that I read in June was Absence, a really curious and interesting book that takes such a different point of view in its narration and is quite daring in doing so, and that it's not a traditional story at all, and that you have a narrator who you really don't know much about him as a person. There are little details that are planted here and there that you can piece together from his life. You know that both of his parents died, but he doesn't even necessarily reflect on his parents' lives all that much outside of close relationships and friendships that his parents had. And he's meditating more on these people whose lives are kind of at once removed from him, or twice removed him, or 3 times removed from him, because it moves between a number of different stories and interactions that he has with individuals who are recounting the stories of other people. And sometimes there are stories within those stories, and so it has this kind of layered and discursive effect of moving between these different accounts and encounters in a way which isn't building a larger portrait of him, but more his reflections on the surprising connections that there are at moments of humanity that he witnesses and ponders and thinks about, and considering all of these people's lives and moments in their lives which have been lost, except for how they are passed down through his conversations with these other individuals. And so it's a really unique way of looking at a life and looking outward at the world and at some really large issues to do with existence, to do with poverty and mental health and drug addiction, but considering them through the stories of other people. And there's just such a great sense of empathy and openness to this story that I really appreciated and that I found surprising and captivating. And also it is so poetically written. I mean, the story is kind of tied together with a poem that he remembers his mother reading to him, and this poem by Oscar Wilde that he keeps thinking back on, and it touches upon this poem in different ways throughout the novel. And so as a debut, I think it's really bold and powerful and beautifully done, and a really striking book that I hope more people read. So those are all the books that I read in the past month. I would love to hear in the comments below if you have read any of these books and what you think about them, or if you're interested in reading them now, or if you want to let me know about anything else that you've read recently. I would love to hear about that. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.